I don't think learning happens without student buy-in and without student ownership of the material. And that's something that I've come to believe in over a decade of teaching, but also through reading in critical pedagogy, especially the work of Paulo Freire, bell hooks, recent literature on ungrading, in an effort to really promote critical thinking and also to create a just and inclusive classroom. I think about the students first, and that's led me to really take some risk in teaching science and religion, doing some things that might not seem obvious to other teachers in terms of methods in the classroom, but also in terms of how I teach the material. So for instance, the last time I taught our science and religion course, I didn't have really any lectures. There was hardly any grading. There were no late penalties, and students focused a lot on their own individual work. My guiding theme for the class was inquiry. How can I focus on students' questions rather than using what Freire calls the banker model of education, just trying to fit material into the student's mind. So I really wanted to focus on encouraging them to develop their own questions so that they would have that kind of student ownership. Really wanted to focus on developing their curiosity. And I really think that inquiry not only meets the student where they are, but also is a particularly important theme for thinking about science and religion. Because if we start with questions, what does it mean to be human? Or what is religion? Or what is the good life? I think students can more obviously get out of this science versus religion kind of mindset and really think about the way that both natural and social sciences and religious studies and theology can lead insight into answering those questions. And so when we start with questions, we kind of touch base with students' existential concerns, things that they already care about, things that they're talking about their friends with, things that they're rethinking that they've learned from their family as they come to college. But also it allows them to see that, these fields that seem like they're on opposite sides methodology, opposite sides of the campus often, each have something to say about these big questions. And so students come to learn that there's really value and a need for integration. And so that helps them get out of, I think, some of the more difficult ways of thinking about science and religion, the kind of baggage they bring into the classroom. Not only did I organize the class around questions, but I encourage students to develop their own questions. One of their major assignments was to just keep a journal of questions that they had as we worked through the material in the class. I was really hoping that then they would be able to generate their own research questions to use for unit end and semester end assignments. And also develop the skills to do further work in science and religion, that they would leave my class, for instance, being the kind of people who could think of questions that engage both science and religion. So I really wanted to focus on getting their curiosity developed. And I was happy to make sacrifices along the way. My students didn't leave that class with a lot of the traditional science and religion material, the history of philosophy of science, for instance, the history of conflict between science and religion, different famous models of thinking about how the disciplines related. But at the very end of the course, I was really confident that every student in the class had developed the kind of curiosity and the kind of methodological insight that would lead them to continue doing high quality work in science and religion. And to me, that's more important than any of that other material. They've now got the framework to understand when they begin learning the history of philosophy of science or studying theological responses to scientific inquiry. So I really focused on that because of my own understanding of pedagogy, but it was only really stronger in the light of the pandemic and thinking about brain fog, really, I think that many people experienced. So how could I tap into curiosity? How could I encourage student ownership and also really help mitigate their anxiety that I think a lot of them were feeling at the idea of engaging with just difficult content and 25 different Zoom meetings throughout the week they had to sort of keep track of. So for me, the pandemic offered an opportunity. I didn't want to replicate a class that was designed for a classroom, and luckily I didn't have to because I hadn't taught this version of this course before. So I was really excited by the modality because when you're not tied to a classroom where everyone's there the same hour and a half and needs to be having the discussion, you can teach the course almost like 75 different independent studies. And I thought there's an opportunity there. So one of the reasons why I didn't do a lot of traditional grading or traditional lectures was I wanted to focus on allowing and encouraging the students to develop their own questions. And that took a lot of feedback from me. So I worked one-on-one with each student. They were all writing multiple times a week. I was giving them heavy feedback on their questions, things that I would encourage them to read. I was really mentoring them almost the way that I mentor students whose theses I'm the director of. So I was able to work with the students so closely that things like deadlines and grades weren't really necessary in terms of external motivation. If a student fell behind, I reached out to them and emailed them. And because we already had a relationship, that mattered. They wanted to be engaged and stay engaged in the course. Because there was no pressure or late penalty, I think they didn't feel the need to lie to me about why they were behind. They didn't feel the need to cheat. And some surprising things happened from this teaching methodology. I heard from multiple students, for instance, that because they could work through the material at their own schedule, that they had spent more time on readings that were more difficult or more interesting for them. So I would get an email from a student saying, I know this was 2 weeks late, I've read it 4 times. I loved it. Or I tracked down some of the footnotes, in this reading, and now I'm gonna write my paper on this, or things like that. It wasn't that in the absence of grading or schedule, the students were just left to their own. Really what this was a kind of one-on-one mentorship that we could kind of transcend those traditional structures. We didn't need them. So that worked particularly well in a course like this. Even when it came to assigning readings and material, I would give them choices. Hey, if you're more interested in this question, read section A. If you're more interested in this, B. And because we weren't all meeting that day to have one discussion, but could break up based on what we did, we had that kind of flexibility. And so I think students were also just more interested than normal. They had agency. They could focus on things that they wanted to do, or at least things that they didn't want to do so much, pick a lesser evil. And so I think they were more engaged. I know that engagement was a big problem for a lot of people teaching this past year, but that was actually the most engaged I've ever had students. And it's the most positive feedback I've ever received on any class in terms of anonymous evaluations. One of our units was oriented around the question, what is religious experience? And I was really, really interested in this question for a number of reasons. It's a huge question within Christian theology to think about how to understand what religious experience is. But it's also a really fun one to engage in terms of science-engaged theology. I introduced the question and the kind of history of the question and what's at stake in a reading guide that students read. They watched a video by Justin Barrett where he explained his own understanding that even if we can identify a cognitive cause for faith, if we can say that the human brain, for instance, sort of tends toward theism or belief in gods, that this shouldn't concern us or worry us, that this doesn't explain away faith, for instance. And his example and his argument is that we can similarly look at chemical changes that happen when people are in love, and this doesn't make us no longer believe in love. And this was such a helpful, I think, comparison because, if I were teaching this class more traditionally, I might have to introduce students to Aristotelian causes and how this is taken up by Aquinas. So it's very, very tedious material that's worthwhile for folks doing graduate work in this field. But for somebody taking a mandatory core class, I thought that Justin's analogy was so helpful to just get students to think about different forms of cause. So do I love my mom just because there's chemicals in my brain? Well, that explains part of it, but I think most of us would feel that that doesn't explain everything. We also learned about the Marsh Chapel experiments, where a number of graduate students were given hallucinogenic drugs while they listened to a lecture by Howard Thurman. And many of them, almost all of them, had mystical experiences. And almost all of those mystical experiences were life-changing. We have interviews 20 years later where these subjects all, I think it's 90% of them identify that as a moment in which their life changed, that they, started doing nonprofit work, that they became just different people and dedicated their life to serving others as a result of this. We also encountered Ralph Hood's idea here. He argues that it's really the fruits, not the roots, that we should think of in terms of identifying a religious experience. He argues that even if something's naturally caused, what do people do with it? If it's mushrooms, if it's loud music, if it's a seizure. If the religious experience leads someone to dedicate their life to serving others, then we ought to really identifying it as real and not see those causes as explaining it away. I focused on material that had kind of one easy to grasp, provocative insight. And I tried to give it to the students in the most simple way possible. And this was largely because it was a pandemic year and I knew they were taxed. So I would include longer readings next time I assign this class to students and this material to students. But these ideas are provocative enough that I think they can really encourage students to really, really clear and higher level thinking. And students are constantly sharing their own intuitions and hunches, which I invited them to bring in, that they didn't need to have formal thoughts out, with each other in small discussion groups. And then engaging in metacognition practices. So I encourage students to regularly reflect on what they had written before. And I think they thought this was some sort of easy, soft assignment. Oh, this professor doesn't do grades, or oh, this professor doesn't have a schedule. But one of the things that kept occurring during these assignments is that I had students write that they had never read their own writing before. So I think what's really common is that college students procrastinate, pull an all-nighter, write something at the end of the semester, go home, never think about it again. And so this small, repetitive, recurring practices of thinking, writing, what are my instincts when I approach this question? How has it changed when I've now encountered someone else's idea or someone else's argument? Doing that over and over, I saw some of the most critical, engaged critical thinking I've ever seen as a teacher. They were writing at a graduate level about these questions. And it wasn't because there was pressure to read long academic articles, and it wasn't because there was pressure to engage in highly formal academic writing. I really believe that it was because they had the space to actually think and the time to actually think, and were encouraged to do the kinds of things that honestly those of us who are intellectuals for a living do, which is a lot of quiet work, reflective work, looking back at over the things that we've read before. So I was really, really excited to see metacognition practices as a kind of perfect hack almost. Students perceive it as easy, and yet it actually encourages them to, I think at a higher level than they do when they're stressed out and trying to write a paper. And so that's something I did mainly when I was trying to think of, what are the easiest ways to get students to engage in this material when many of my students are in Queens, in dealing with some of the most stressful aspects of the pandemic in the past year. But that's something I'm going to keep. It's something I like much more than having them write papers, is to write short, quick reflections and to be consistently engaging with their past selves. I've taught online before, and one of the things that I know is a trap, both for professor and student, is to see it as a kind of to-do list one has to do. And if you've ever had to take one of those driving courses, if you get a ticket, I think it's not hard to imagine how easy a set of tasks online can become something you want to race through, or can I skip to the test or something? I was really trying to fight the way that learning online can be impersonal, both in terms of the disconnect between the student and me. So part of my Giving feedback and individually tailoring assignments was about connecting with them and having a relationship, or as much as fun as we could. But I also wanted to have them connect with each other. It's a really nice thing to come to a classroom and feel a little confused and whisper to the person next to you, get help that way, especially if you don't feel comfortable or you're a little intimidated about asking the professor, oh shoot, I think they just said what I asked, so I'm not gonna ask them and let them know that I wasn't listening or something. So there were all sorts of ways that being in person allow students to, or supports students learning that we're missing online. And so I wanted to make it personal. So I did a few things to do this. I spent a lot of time contacting students and being available to them. I created spaces where they could ask each other for help. So they all had small groups that they were in discussion boards all semester where they could ask questions. So it wasn't just about me saying, what did you think of the reading this week? It was also a place where they could ask questions like, did anybody understand what she was talking about? And I tried not to moderate them too carefully so that they could feel free to do that. I kept an occasional watch to make sure that nothing went off the rails. But by and large, they were their own spaces. And one of the things I also created was a couple of just for fun things. I had no idea if it would work. I created a space where they could compliment one another because it's so easy to try and do just the bare minimum to get credit for things. But this was a place where they could recognize one another. Oh, wow, so-and-so really went above and beyond and it helped me understand the material. Or so-and-so has been allowing me to text them and ask what the homework is. And I was actually inspired by the TheoPsych rally and including that discussion board. And another thing I did was include a song for every reading. So every day that there was work, I just included a song that I thought was thematically relevant. It was silly. I never explained it. I never said, here's the psychology behind this or anything. But I just wanted to connect with them in another way. I had been a boarding school teacher before I did my PhD, and I remember how powerful it was to have a student who was checked out, didn't like the class, felt antagonistic, and to go to their basketball game and to see them shine and to connect and congratulate them and then have the relationship turn. So I knew that it could be really valuable to connect with students about something that wasn't the work and wasn't, their mandatory theology class they had to take for their pharmacy degree. So I had a lot of conversations with students about music. They would write notes to me after their homework. I love listening to this song. This reminds me of this song that I love. They were recommending music to me by the end. One of the assignments that I allowed them to do for their final project, I said that they could make a unit themselves. This assignment allowed them to do really deep thinking. When you teach something, you have to understand it more than when you're just regurgitating it. But it didn't take the same time that writing a formal paper would. So this was actually a option that a lot of students chose to develop a unit for the class. And it was so fun to see what their own questions were. And I'm inspired the next time I teach, I'll probably crib some of their ideas. But one of the things that I thought was really fun is that most of the students who took that option included their own music. So even if they had never told me that they had liked that part of the class or had never come up in conversation with them, they had clearly internalized it. And so it became a kind of language to talk to the students. It was one way that wasn't, teacher-student or about theology. It was a way of connecting with them. It's really important to find multiple ways of connecting because people have all sorts of baggage with taking religion courses. They have baggage with education. They've had relationships with teachers who they can't trust. And so I think the more that I can as a teacher find ways to just connect, the better students will be supported and enabled to really learn and dig into the material. So one thing that's nice about teaching online is that you can engage really difficult subject matter, I think actually more easily, because it's easy to provide content warnings and allow students to engage with the material on their own pace. They can wait till they're home for the weekend because they feel more comfortable in their childhood bedroom, or they can make sure they're, holding a teddy bear when they're engaging the material. But, when it comes to thinking about really traumatic material, the goal is to not force someone to deal with it under circumstances that are really difficult for them. So we might give a trigger warning for reading so the student doesn't accidentally do it on the bus on the way to work and have some sort of really difficult response that they can't manage and lose their job. And we don't want students to have to run out of a room embarrassed because they're crying or something in a classroom. So not only with the material they were reading on their own, but also in terms of the engagement, teaching online allowed me to press a little further in difficult subject matter because students could still log into the discussion on their own time. They could log out if they needed to take a break. So one of the things that I really honestly wasn't even expecting, and so I'm glad I taught it first online, was how many students had really strong emotional responses to the ideas of drug-induced mystical experiences. So I had a couple of students who let me know one-on-one, and again, I was glad I had been developing those relationships, that they had family members who had really, really horrific relationships to various kinds of drugs. And so their reaction to that material, that folks are actually using drugs to produce or precipitate, mystical experience, was really, really strong. They were worried that this was kind of reckless or irresponsible, or even, one student brought to me that, maybe it was problematic to teach this, as if I could be encouraging students to, do shrooms on the weekend or something. So I think a really, really lucky thing that we were able to work one-on-one and talk with students. And some of them felt comfortable sharing those concerns with other students in discussions. Some of them didn't. But it ended up being a really, really valuable space for those students. And some of them even let me know in their final projects that they ended up changing their mind or having a more nuanced view of particularly hallucinogenic drugs. But that was something that really was difficult. Oftentimes in the humanities, the classroom is already sort of flipped. Students do their reading at night and come in ready to discuss the material, for instance, or hear a lecture. But I think one of the things that I would like to try out as I transition to face-to-face teaching this class is to allow students to similarly choose tracks of different material in the class. I'll probably be using small groups to do this, but I'd like to conceive of the classroom as a kind of lab instead of a lecture space, or even honestly a whole class group discussion space, where students, if they are engaging in any kind of lecture material from me, it's recorded and they're able to watch it beforehand. But when they come into the class, it'll be them working on their own research and conversation with perhaps the 5 other students in the classroom who did that same reading. And doing that well is going to require a lot of attention from me to each student. It's going to require them taking ownership of the class. But I think it'll be worth it. I'm excited to take the risk and to learn from what I've done and continue to try and modify it. I'm sure it won't completely work. I'm sure this is something that I'm going to have to fine-tune over time and learn from. But I think I may never lecture again.